Hi, welcome to Ikate's Crossing as I continue with the Celestine prophecy and adventure. The next morning I awoke suddenly with a dream still fresh in my mind. For a minute or two I stared at the bedroom ceiling, remembering it fully. I had been making my way through a forest, searching for something. The forest was large and exceptionally beautiful. In my quest, I found myself in a number of situations in which I felt totally lost and bewildered, unable to decide how to proceed. Incredibly, at each of these moments, a person would appear out of nowhere, as though by design to clarify where I needed to go next. I never became aware of the object of my search, but the dream had left me feeling incredibly upbeat and confident. I sat up and noticed a beam of sunlight coming through the window across the room. It sparkled with suspended dust particles. I walked over and pulled back the curtains. The day was radiant, blue sky, bright sunshine. A stiff breeze gently rocked the trees. The lake would be rippled and glistening this time of the day, and the wind chilly against a swimmer's wet skin. I walked outside and dove in. I surfaced and swam out to the middle of the lake, turning on my back to look at the familiar mountains. The lake rested in a deep valley where three mountain ridges converged, a perfect lake site discovered by my grandfather in his youth. It had now been 100 years since he had first walked those ridges, a child explorer, a prodigy growing up in a world that was still wild with cougar and boar and Creek Indians that lived in primitive cabins up on the North Ridge. He'd sworn at the time that one day he would live in this perfect valley, with its massive old trees and seven springs, and finally he had. Later, to build a lake and a cabin, and to take countless walks with a young grandson. I never quite understood my grandfather's fascination with this valley, but I always tried to preserve the land, even when civilization encroached and surrounded. In the middle of the lake, I could see a particular rock outcropping near the crest of the North Ridge. The day before, in the tradition of my grandfather, I had climbed to that overhang, trying to find some peace in the view, and in the smells and the way the wind whirled in the tree tops. And as I had sat up there surveying the lake and the dense foliage in the valley below, I had slowly felt better, as if the energy and the perspective were dissolving some block in my mind. A few hours later, I had been talking with Charlene and hearing about the manuscript. I swam back and pulled myself up on the wooden pier in front of a cabin. I knew all of this was too much to believe. I mean, here I was, hiding out in these hills, feeling totally disenchanted with my life, when out of the blue Charlene shows up and explains the cause of my restlessness, quoting some old manuscript that promises the secret of human existence. Yet I also knew that Charlene's arrival was exactly the sort of coincidence of which the manuscript spoke, one that seemed too unlikely to be a mere chance event. Could this ancient document be correct? Have we been slowly building, in spite of our denial and cynicism, a critical mass of people conscious of these coincidences? Were humans now in a position to understand this phenomenon, and thus finally to understand the purpose behind itself, life itself? What, I wondered, would this new understanding be? Would the remaining insights in the manuscript tell us, as the priest had said? I faced a decision. Because of the manuscript, I felt a new direction open in my life, a new point of interest. The question was what to do now. I could remain here, or I could find a way to explore further. The issue of danger entered my mind. Who had stolen Charlene's briefcase? Was it someone working to suppress the manuscript? How could I know? I thought about the possible risk for a long time, but finally my mood of optimism prevailed. I decided not to worry. I would be careful and go slowly. I walked inside and called the travel agency with the largest ad in the yellow pages. The agent with whom I spoke said he could indeed arrange a trip to Peru. In fact, by chance, there was a cancellation. I could fill a flight with reservations already confirmed at a hotel in Lima. I could have the whole package at a discount, he said, if I could leave in 3 hours. 3 hours. Chapter 2. The Longer Now. After a frenzy of packing and a wild ride on the freeway, I arrived at the airport with just enough time to pick up my ticket and board the flight for Peru. As I walked into the plane's tail section and sat down in a window seat, fatigue swept over me. I thought about a nap, but when I stretched out and closed my eyes, I found I couldn't relax. I suddenly felt nervous and ambivalent about the trip. Was it crazy to depart with no preparation? Where would I go in Peru? To whom would I talk? The confidence I had experienced at the lake was quickly fading back into skepticism. Both the first insight and the idea of a cultural transformation again seemed fanciful and unrealistic, and as I thought about it, the concept of a second insight seemed just as unlikely. How could a new historical perspective institute our perception of those coincidences and keep them conscious in the public mind? I stretched out further and took a deep breath. Maybe it would be a useless trip, I concluded. Just a quick run to Peru and back. A waste of money, perhaps, but no real harm done. The plane jerked forward and taxied out to the runway. I closed my eyes and felt a mild dizziness as the big jet reached the critical speed and lifted into the thick cloud cover. When we reached cruising altitude, I finally relaxed and drifted into sleep. 30 or 40 minutes later, a stretch of turbulence woke me up and I decided to go to the restroom. As I made my way through the lounge area, I noticed a tall man with round glasses standing near the window, talking to a flight attendant. He glanced at me briefly, then continued speaking. He had dark brown hair and appeared to be about 45 years old. For an instant I thought I recognized him, but after looking at his features closely, I concluded he was no one I knew. As I walked past, I could hear part of the conversation. Thanks anyway, the man said. I just thought since you travelled to Peru so often that perhaps you'd heard something about the manuscript. He turned away and walked towards the front of the plane. I was dumbstruck. Was he speaking of the same manuscript? I walked into the restroom and tried to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to forget about it. Probably he was talking about something else, some other book. I returned to my seat and closed my eyes again, content to write off the instant, glad I didn't have to ask the man what he meant. But as I sat there, I thought about the excitement I had felt at the lake. What if this man actually had information about the manuscript? What might happen then? If I didn't inquire, I would never know. I wavered several more times in my mind, then finally stood up and walked towards the front of the plane. Finding him about midway up the aisle, directly behind him was an empty seat. I walked back and told an attendant I wanted to move, and gathered my things and took the seat. After a few minutes, I tapped him on the shoulder. Excuse me, I said. I heard you mention a manuscript. Were you speaking of the one found in Peru? He looked surprised, then cautious. Yes, I was, he said tentatively. I introduced myself and explained that a friend had been in Peru recently and had informed me of the manuscript's existence. He visibly relaxed and introduced himself as Wayne Dobson, an assistant professor of history from New York University. As we spoke, I noticed a look of irritation coming from the gentleman sitting next to me. He had leaned back in his seat and was attempting to sleep. Have you seen the manuscript? I asked the professor. Parts of it, he said. Have you? No, but a friend of mine told me about the first insight. The man beside me changed his position. Dobson looked his way. Excuse me, sir, I know we're disturbing you. Would it be too much trouble for you to exchange seats with me? No, the man said, that would be preferable. We all stepped into the aisle, and then I slid back into the window seat, and Dobson sat beside me. Tell me, what you heard concerning the first insight, Dobson said. I paused for a moment, trying to sum up in my mind what I understood. I guess the first insight is an awareness of the mysterious occurrences that changes one's life, the feeling that some other process is operating. I felt observed as I said it. Dobson picked up on my discomfort. What do you think of that insight, he asked. I don't know, I said. It doesn't quite fit with our modern day common sense, does it? Wouldn't you feel better dismissing the whole idea and getting back to thinking about practical matters? I laughed and nodded affirmatively. Well, that's everyone's tendency. Even though we occasionally have the clear insight that something more is going on in life, our habitual way of thinking is to consider such ideas unknowable, and then to shrug off the awareness altogether. That's why the second insight is necessary. Once we see the historical background to our awareness, it seems more valid. I nodded. Then, as a historian, you think the manuscript's prediction of a global transformation is accurate? Yes, as a historian, yes. But you have to look at the history in the correct way. He took a deep breath. Believe me, I say this as one who has spent a lot of years of studying and teaching history in the wrong way. I used to focus solely on the technological accomplishments of civilization and the great men who brought about this progress. What's wrong with that approach? Nothing as far as it goes. But what's really important is the world view of each historical period, what the people were feeling and thinking. It took me a long time to understand that. History is supposed to provide a knowledge of the longer context within which our lives take place. History is not just the evolution of technology, it is the evolution of thought. By understanding the reality of the people who came before us, we can see why we look at the world the way we do, and what our contribution is toward further progress. We can pinpoint where we come in, so to speak, in the longer development of civilization, and that gives us a sense of where we're going. He paused, then added, the effect of the second insight is to provide exactly this kind of historical perspective, less from the point of view of Western thought, places the manuscript's predictions in a longer context that makes them seem not only plausible, but inevitable. I asked Dobson how many insights he had seen, and he told me only the first two. He had found them, he said, after a rumour about the manuscript prompted a short trip to Peru 3 weeks ago. Once I arrived in Peru, he continued, I met a couple of people who confirmed the manuscript's existence, yet seemed scared to death to talk much about it. They said the government had gone a little loco and was making physical threats against anyone who had copies or dispersed information. His face turned serious. That made me nervous. But later a waiter at my hotel told me about a priest he knew who often spoke of the manuscript. The waiter said the priest was trying to fight the government's effort to suppress the artifact. I couldn't resist going to a private dwelling where this priest supposedly spent most of his time. I must have looked surprised because Dobson asked, what's wrong? My friend, I replied, the one who told me about the manuscript, learned what she knew from a priest. He wouldn't give his name, but she talked with him once about the first insight. She was scheduled to meet up with him again, but he never showed up. It may have been the same man, Dobson said, because I couldn't find him either. The house was locked up and looked deserted. You never saw him? No, but I decided to look around. There was an old storage building in the back that was open, and for some reason I decided to explore it. Behind some trash under a loose board in the wall, I found translations of the first and second insights. He looked at me knowingly. You just happened to find them? I asked. Yes. Did you bring the insights with you on this trip? He shook his head. No. I decided to study them thoroughly and then leave them with some of my colleagues. Could you give me a summary of the second insight? I asked. There was a long pause, then Dobson smiled and nodded. I guess that's why we're here. The second insight, he said, puts our current awareness into a longer historical perspective. After all, when the decade of the 90s is over, we'll be finishing up not only the 20th century, but a 1,000-year period of history as well. We'll be completing the entire second millennium. Before we in the West can understand what we are and what is going to occur next, we must understand what has really been happening during this current 1,000-year period. What does the manuscript say exactly? I asked. It says that at the close of the second millennium, that's now, we will be able to see that entire period of history as a whole, and we will identify a particular preoccupation that developed during the later half of this millennium in what has been called the modern age. Our awareness of the coincidences today represent a kind of awakening from this preoccupation. What's the preoccupation? I asked. He gave me a mischievous half smile. Are you ready to relive the millennium? Sure, tell me about it. It's not enough for me to tell you about it. Remember what I said before? To understand history, you must grasp how your everyday view of the world developed, how it was created by the reality of the people who lived before you. It took 1,000 years to evolve the modern way of looking at things, and to really understand where you are today, you must take yourself back to the year 1000 and then move forward through the entire millennium experientially, as though you've lived through the whole period yourself in a single lifetime. How do I do that? I'll guide you through it. I hesitated for a moment, glancing out of the window at the land formations far below. Time was already beginning to feel different. I'll try, I said finally. Okay, he replied. Imagine yourself being alive in the year 1000, in what we've called the Middle Ages. The first thing you must understand is that the reality of this time is being defined by the powerful churchmen of the Christian churches. Because of their position, these men hold great influence over the minds of the populace. And the world these churchmen describe as real is above all spiritual. They are creating a reality which places their idea about God's plan for mankind at the very center of life. Visualize this, he continued. You find yourself in the class of your father, essentially peasant or aristocrat, and you know that you will always be confined to this class. But regardless of which class you're in, or the particular work that you do, you soon realize that social position is secondary to the spiritual reality of life as defined by the churchmen. Life is about passing a spiritual test. You discover The churchmen explain that God had placed mankind at the center of his universe, surrounded by the entire cosmos, for one solitary purpose: to win or lose salvation. And in this trial, you must correctly choose between two opposing forces, the force of God and the lurking temptations of the devil. But understand that you don't face this contest alone, he continued. In fact, as a mere individual, you aren't qualified to determine your status in this regard. This is the provenance of the churchmen. They are there to interpret the scriptures and to tell you every step of the way, whether you're in accordance with God or whether you're being duped by Satan. If you follow their instructions, you are assured that rewarding afterlife will follow. But if you fail to heed the course they prescribe, then, well, there is excommunication and certain damnation. Dobson looked at me intensely. The manuscript says that the important thing to understand here is that every aspect of the medieval world is defined in otherworldly terms. All the phenomena of life, from the chance thunderstorm or earthquake to the success of crops or the death of a loved one, is defined either as the will of God or as the malice of the devil. There is no concept of weather or geological forces or horticultural or disease. All that comes later. For now you completely believe by the churchmen. The world you take for granted operates solely by spiritual means. He stopped talking and looked at me. Are you there? Yes, I can see that reality. Well, imagine that reality now beginning to break down. What do you mean? The medieval worldview, your worldview, begins to fall apart in the 14th and 15th centuries. First, you notice certain improprieties on the part of the churchmen themselves, secretly violating their vows of chastity, for example, or taking gratuities to look the other way when governmental officials violate scriptural laws. These improprieties alarm you because these churchmen hold themselves to be the only connection between yourself and God. Remember, they are the only interpreters of the scriptures, the sole arbitrators of your salvation. Suddenly you're in the midst of an outright rebellion. A group led by Martin Luther is calling for a complete break from papal Christianity. The churchmen are corrupt, they say, demanding an end to the churchman's reign over the minds of people. New churches are being formed based on the idea that each person should be able to have access to the scriptures personally and to interpret them as they wish with no middleman. As you watch in disbelief, the rebellion succeeds. The churchmen begin to lose. For centuries these men defined reality, and now before your eyes they are losing their credibility. Consequently, the whole world has been thrown into question. The clear consensus about the nature of the universe and about humankind's purpose here, based as it was on the churchman's description, is collapsing, leaving you and all the other humans in Western culture in a very precarious place. After all, you've grown accustomed to having an authority in your life to define reality, and without external direction you feel confused and lost. If the churchman's description of reality and the reason for human existence is wrong, you ask, then what is right? He paused for a moment. Do you see the impact of the collapse on the people of that day? I suppose it was somewhat unsettling, I said. To say the least, he replied. There was a tremendous upheaval. The old world view was being challenged everywhere. In fact, by the 1600s, astronomers had proved beyond the doubt that the sun and stars did not revolve around the earth as maintained by the church. Clearly, the earth was only one small planet orbiting a minor sun in a galaxy that contained billions of such stars. He leaned toward me. This is important. Mankind has lost its place at the center of God's universe. See the effect this had? Now, when you watch the weather, or plants growing, or someone suddenly die, what you feel is an anxious bafflement. In the past, you might have said God was responsible, or the devil, but as the medieval world view breaks down, that certainly goes with it. All the things you took for granted now need due definition, especially the nature of God and your relationship to God. With that awareness, he went on, the modern age begins. There was a growing democratic spirit and a mass distrust of papal and the royal authority. Definitions of the universe based on speculation or scriptural faith are no longer automatically accepted. In spite of the loss of certainty, we didn't want to risk some new group controlling our reality as the churchmen had. If you had been there, you would have participated in the creation of a new mandate for science. A what? He laughed. You would have looked down on this vast, undefined universe, and you would have thought, as did the thinkers of that day, that we needed a method of consensus building, a way to systematically explore this new world of ours. and you would have called this new way of discovering reality the scientific method, which is nothing more than testing an idea about how the universe works, arriving afterward at some conclusion, then offering this conclusion to others to see if they agree. Then he continued, you would have prepared explorers to go out into this new universe, each armed with the scientific method, and you would have given them their historic mission. Explore this place, find out how it works and what it means that we find ourselves alive here. You knew you had lost your certainty about a God-ruled universe, and because of that, your certainty about the nature of God itself. But you felt you had a method, a consensus-building process, through which you could discover the nature of everything around you, including God, and including the true purpose of mankind's existence on the planet. So you sent these explorers out to find the true nature of the situation and to report back. He paused and looked at me. The manuscript, he says at this point we begin the preoccupation from which we are awakening now. We sent these explorers out to bring back a complete explanation of our existence, but because of the complexity of the universe, they weren't able to return right away. What was the preoccupation? Put yourself in that time period again, he said, when the scientific method couldn't bring back a new picture of God and of mankind's purpose on the planet. The lack of certainty and meaning affected Western culture deeply. We needed something else to do until our questions were answered. Eventually we arrived at what seemed to be a very logical solution. We looked at each other and said, well, since our explorers have not yet returned with our true spiritual situation, why not settle into this new world of ours while we are waiting? We are certainly learning enough to manipulate this new world for our own benefit. So why not work in the meantime to raise our standard of living, our sense of security in the world? He looked at me and grinned. And that's what we did. 4 centuries ago, we shook off our feeling of being lost by taking matters into our own hands, by focusing on conquering the earth and using its resources to better our situation. And only now, as we approach the end of the millennium, can we see what happened. Our focus gradually becomes a preoccupation. We totally lost ourselves in creating a circular security, an economic security to replace the spiritual one we had lost. The question of why we were alive, of what was actually going on here spiritually, was slowly pushed aside and repressed altogether. He looked at me intently and said, working to establish the more comfortable style of survival has grown to feel completely in and of itself as a reason to live. And we've gradually, methodically forgotten our original question. We've forgotten that we still don't know what we're surviving for. That's it for today. Don't forget to check the links down below. Check the links on my channel. Like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you know when the next video will be uploaded. Take care and blessed be.